Hey everyone, Anarch here, and this is another episode of Anarch Abridged. And the topic of today's episode is going to be, how do we build an anarchist revolution? This video is actually going to be pulling from my other video, Constructing the Revolution, as well as some of the features from A Modern Anarchism Part 3 titled Revolution. However, before we get started, I just want to make an announcement about my Patreon. From here on out, I'm going to be donating 5% of the proceeds of my Patreon to the group Cooperation Tulsa, and that will be taking place every single month. So just know, if you become a patron, not only do you get access to the Anarch Discord server, and you get to assist me in spending more time developing videos for this channel, but you'll also be contributing directly to a revolutionary, communalist, social ecologist group here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So what is Cooperation Tulsa? Well, Cooperation Tulsa is a group that was developed during the George Floyd protests, and which is part of the Symbiosis Federation here in the United States. And our first few projects were focused around creating community gardens at historically black churches in the Greenwood district. After this, we actually opened a community center, which was a hub for a bunch of local activity where we did teach-ins and we had a tool library and all kinds of other things, even though we were not able to keep that community center open. And during that period of time we were developing those community gardens, we were actually donated a 2.5 acre plot of land, which we call Flat Rock. When we first got Flat Rock, it was actually a dumping site, and it took us the entire first year just to get it cleaned up. Now, we are developing all kinds of things out at Flat Rock. We are going to be creating more of these community gardens out there, and we're going to be automating as much of this as possible. We are going to be creating compost. We are going to be creating, hopefully, more community spaces. And using this land as our basis, we are going to be reaching out and trying to create popular assemblies in the areas around Flat Rock. But I won't go on too much longer about Cooperation Tulsa. I know that's not why you're here. However, it is pretty directly related to the topic of this video, which is, how do you actually build a revolution? And I should be specific that this video probably won't go into every single aspect of how to build a revolution, but what it will do is tell you what kinds of social structures you need to build in order to make something that can later turn into a social revolution. Because in the previous videos, we laid out how power structures work and we laid out what anarchy looks like, but we didn't really talk about how you might go from here to there. That is what this video is going to be about, and possibly the next video, depending on how far we get into this. So let's jump into it. So you may remember this concept of means-ends unity from the previous videos in this lecture series. And this concept of means-ends unity is very important in understanding the anarchist revolutionary praxis. Remember, means-ends unity says that we can't create bodies which are contrary to our desired ends and hope to ever actually achieve those ends. Instead, what we have to do is we have to endeavor to create bodies which are as similar to our ends as is conceivably possible within our current conditions. So this leads us to a key principle within anarchism, and that is direct action. So what is direct action? Well, direct action is essentially acting without intermediates. It is the idea that we cannot trust to some other power structure to do the work for us. We're not going to go and petition the government for our needs. We are not going to trust some non-profit to solve our problems. Instead, direct action says that we should act directly in the world in order to solve those problems. The reason I bring this up right after means-ends unity is because this is a perfect example of means-ends unity in action. If we want to create a society wherein our concerted actions, our cooperation within organizational structures is supposed to be what manages and administrates society, then obviously we have to do that in the here and now. We can't expect these enemy structures to give us the world that we would like to see. This means that anarchists oppose entryism, electoralism, and begging for reforms from power structures. Instead, what anarchists say is that if we want to get anything from those hierarchical power structures, we have to create these forms of leverage which are going to force that power structure into giving us what we want. And if that power structure refuses to give us what we want, we will begin to do it ourselves. Instead of relying on the government to give us housing, we should be able to provide housing for our people. Instead of relying on some nonprofit to feed us, we should instead try to feed ourselves. And obviously, this is a tall order. Creating alternative structures is not easy, and it takes lots of time. So this reminds me of a quote by David Graeber, and David Graeber says, "Protest is like begging the powers that be to dig a well, whereas direct action is digging the well and daring them to stop you." Once you understand this concept of direct action, I think you'll find that a lot of what anarchists do makes a lot more sense. Because we cannot rely on any of these hierarchical power structures to give us these necessary handouts, this means that we have to intervene directly to get things done. So this also brings us to what I think is another really important concept, and that is anarchism has both a constructive and a deconstructive aspect. The anarchist does not only seek to deconstruct hierarchical power structures, they also seek to construct horizontal power structures. And I think this latter part is best embodied in this concept of prefiguration. Prefiguration is often stated as building the new in the shell of the old. And surprisingly, a lot of people don't really know what I mean when I say that, so I'll go into a little more detail. First, I'll just return us to what I said a moment ago about direct action. So obviously, our direct action, if what we seek to do is construct our power from the bottom up, that means that we have to actively construct that power. We can't just rely on protests and demonstrations and various forms of militancy. Instead, we have to carefully go about crafting these horizontal power structures that we wish to see characterize the future world. So this sort of brings us back to what I talked about in the first part of this lecture series, when I discussed the 4 fields of power structures. Our work is to create horizontal power structures in all 4 of those fields that I discussed. This means that we need to change people's individual and ideological conditioning. We need to change the way that people interpersonally interact with one another. We need to construct new social structures which embody our horizontal values. And we need to develop environmental structures, that is to say, places that we dwell in this world that are characterized by horizontal management. Building all of these structures in the here and now is prefiguration. We're trying to get those structures to match the description I gave of anarchy in the previous part as much as is conceivably possible. And of course, I need to emphasize this caveat, the as much as is conceivably possible part of what I just said. Because the truth is, we can't create perfectly these bodies that will characterize a future world within the world we currently have. Because all of those power structures which surround us are preventing us from creating these alternative power structures. When we create horizontal power structures, they are constantly at war with hierarchical power structures, whether we want them to be or not. And so, even though in an anarchy, all structures might be characterized by a sort of baseline solidarity, the structures that we create can't take for granted that all of the structures surrounding them will practice proper solidarity. So what we have to do is we have to create bodies which are capable of going into conflict with hierarchical power without sacrificing their basic principles. These bodies then have to take into account all of the different sorts of hierarchical power that exists in society and ask ourselves how we can go about developing the 4 fields of our power structure to overcome those hierarchies. This means that we have to go from capitalism to socialism, from white supremacy to racial diversity, from patriarchy to gender equity, from ableism to disability justice, from gerontocracy to youth liberation, from transphobia to bodily autonomy, from xenophobia to humanism, from speciesism to animal liberation, from reductionism to holism, from hierarchical society to horizontal society. This is why it is so incredibly important that our anarchism is intersectional. And this is something that I've sort of left out in this lecture series, but which I probably should have mentioned earlier on, and that is the anarchism that I promote is not an economically reductionist anarchism. That is to say, it does not only focus on being anti-capitalist, it's also focused on dismantling all forms of hierarchical power. And because it believes holistically in prefiguration, it recognizes that none of those can be left to wait for a post-revolutionary society. What we've seen is that when anarchists conceive that some of these issues have to wait, that instead they just never really get dealt with, and they instead act as a sort of poison within the movement that causes it to backslide into forms of hierarchy which it was previously trying to destroy. Anarchists have to recognize that if they are going to fight against hierarchical power, this requires an intersectional approach. So what do I actually mean by intersectionality? Because this has become a sort of buzzword within our communities. Intersectionality is the concept that all different forms of oppression have various forms of intersections which themselves sort of reconstitute what those people experience at those intersections. So this is to say, not every Black person is going to experience the same form of oppression. Instead, they might experience what it's like to uniquely be a Black woman, or a Black Indigenous woman, or a Black homosexual Indigenous woman. All of these together don't just stack on top of each other and sort of additively create some new oppression, but instead it sort of creates a uniquely different form of oppression. This form of patriarchal dominance is now mediated through anti-Blackness. This homophobic conception is now also imbued with the sort of homophobia of the Black community at the same time as it is imbued with patriarchal dominance, and so on. This is just one example I'm giving, but you can see that this form of analysis, it gives us an understanding of how all of these different oppressions uniquely manifest themselves for each given person. This also means we can't do a sort of oppression Olympics where we just rank one oppression above another. What we have to do instead is understand how every person's oppression affects them uniquely based on how they lie at the intersections of various oppressions. This is also important because it helps us understand which constituencies may have a sort of baseline militancy by way of their prevailing oppression by various power structures. Those who are multiply marginalized are generally going to be the people that you want to organize together to overthrow the hierarchies in their lives. But it's not as simple as the liberals make it out to be, such that all they seem to really care about is changing people's ideology and their interpersonal bigotry. That is to say, instead of being against white supremacy, they're against racism. Instead of being against patriarchy, they're against sexism. They're not trying to dismantle the structures that lead to those problems. Instead, they're trying to deal with how they manifest themselves in an interpersonal sense, with people exhibiting their bigoted opinions vocally in interaction with other people. The anarchist instead has to have a conception of how social structures, such as patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism, are what actually bolster all of these harmful aspects. This means that we have to create alternative social structures, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this video. That is to say, what kinds of social structures can we construct that might actually be able to fight back against these forms of social structural intersectional oppression? In my video, Constructing the Revolution, I say that this can be kind of split up into 4 pillars of prefiguration. These 4 pillars are councils, economics, defense, and intelligence. So I'm going to cover each of these now and tell you what I mean by each of those pillars. In my work, Constructing the Revolution, I start the section on councils by saying, when I use the word council, I'm referring to a horizontal, freely associated, directly democratic body, which is composed of the people from some particular region, interest, identity, or profession. In these councils, all proposals are created and brought to a vote by the members, not some narrow leadership. And if the council needs to delegate someone to carry out a task, that delegation is temporary and able to be revoked by a simple majority at any time. So you'll notice that in this definition, I am advocating formal structure. I'm not just saying that we should all come together and sort of haphazardly make decisions. Instead, I'm advocating that we create formal methodologies by which we can make those decisions. I should also note that aspect about them being able to be focused around a region or an identity or a specific cause. This is important because it allows us to embody that principle of autonomy that we discussed in the last part of this video series. It's not bad for various kinds of councils to be created, even within a larger council. It may be, for example, that you want to create a sort of municipal council. A council that tries to bring together as many people as possible within a municipality and get them to make decisions together about how they will manage their own lives. So, using Cooperation Tulsa as an example, Cooperation Tulsa is itself a council body. In Cooperation Tulsa, we make all of our decisions through a directly democratic process where everyone is involved and there is no form of structural hierarchical power. Instead, anyone can bring a proposal to the floor, and then it will be voted on by consensus. If there is any form of delegation, that is to say, if anybody is supposed to carry out a task uniquely, that person can have that delegation revoked at the whim of the people within the group. However, within the bylaws of Cooperation Tulsa, we even suggest that there should be a women's council and an indigenous people's council and a black people's council. All of these are useful in balancing the needs of people within the greater body of Cooperation Tulsa. And that's only the internal aspect. In the external aspect, in every project that Cooperation Tulsa develops, we try to establish a sort of directly democratic body which lies over that project, and by which the people that are involved in that project might come together and make decisions about how it will be managed in the future. In the near future, for example, Cooperation Tulsa seeks to create popular assemblies, which are going to be located in people's neighborhoods or city blocks, and which will help people come together and make decisions as one of those pertinent groups about the things that are affecting them and how they might come forth to struggle against the problems that they have. Councils of the sort that I'm describing here are incredibly important. In fact, I would say they are integral to any successful revolutionary movement. Unless you create a variety of these sorts of horizontal council structures, you are not going to be prepared to organize and coordinate a complex society, because it has to be understood. These horizontal power structures are meant to expand and subsume more and more people, more and more economic resources, such that they come to be a threat to hierarchical power structures. That means we want to start with the formality of the council in everything that we do, so that we are prepared to take this formality and apply it to the circumstances that we encounter. This is doubly important because this prepares us for rupture. What's been found is that if anarchists don't create these bodies ahead of time, then they are forced to create them on the spot after a rupture arrives. But the strength of creating them ahead of time is that when the rupture arrives, we've already been managing ourselves horizontally for years or even decades, possibly. This means that we won't be caught off guard by success, and we won't be forced to scramble to put something together that will allow us to coordinate large-scale resources that we may get our hands on. Next is economics. So I've separated economics because it's a big sphere, and it includes all kinds of things. But I think some of the most important things it probably includes is cooperatives, unions, community land trusts, time banks, mutual aid and direct distribution support. Each of these are examples of economic bodies. These are those bodies which allow us to wage war against capitalism without direct, violent militancy. On each of these fronts, as we push forward, we successfully push back how much of society that capitalism controls. And I mentioned that we should both develop cooperatives and unions because it's incredibly important that we not only develop our own autonomous power in the form of cooperatives and community land trusts, but also that we fight on the enemy's battlefield to push back their control of their own corporations and to fight for higher wages for working people in the form of unions. I should also mention that expropriation and squatting probably qualify under this category of economics. That's because in this process of expropriation or squatting, we are actually taking resources into our hands, which we then occupy and manage together. It's very important that we have both this constructive and combative vision about what we're doing in the economic sphere, because if all we do is fight with unions in order to overtake the workplaces that we are occupied within, well then the means of production and the management of the economy still rests within the hands of the capitalists themselves. We remain workers, and we have this continued relationship to the rest of the economy of being workers. Whereas if we were to carry out some form of vast expropriation when a revolution of some kind approaches, we're going to have to go from being workers to also being administrators and coordinators of various kinds, both within the workplace and within the broader economy. Cooperatives allow us to develop those skills, which are going to allow us to do coordination and to understand how to manage a complex economy well before that rupture ever arrives. You might consider them sort of revolutionary training grounds for the sort of things we're going to have to do after we succeed. And this is not to say that unions are not important. In fact, unions are very important because the truth is cooperatives are unlikely to comprise the majority of the economy at any given point. It's more likely that cooperatives will end up being a single or maybe double-digit percentage of the economy when the time comes that we are actually in some sort of process of conflict with the prevailing power structures. So what that means is all of those people who are stuck in the capitalist mode of labor, those people also need defense from capitalist exploitation and a way to fight back against their exploitation within their workplaces. And that is the role of the union. I think that we're going to need both cooperatives and unions. We're going to need things like time banks. We're going to need mutual aid and direct distribution. We're going to need intentional communities. We're going to need all of these things combined together in order to create the sort of economic power that we need to go into conflict with these prevailing hierarchical power structures. This is a sort of economic engine that helps us build up resources and distribute them. These resources can then be funneled into our councils, funneled into our organizations, used to fund our strikes, and so on. The next pillar is defense. So defense is precisely what it sounds like. This concept of defense is basically a recognition that violence is part of the realm of politics and that there is no escaping it. And that's to say that we need to not only be able to defend people where they're at, but we need to be prepared to defend all of the gains that we have made in the case that some sort of civil conflict or greater revolutionary rupture does take place. If we have to create our defenses on the spot, it is almost guaranteed that we will lose. So that's why in my video, Constructing the Revolution, I say,
some examples of defense organizations which might be formed are Copwatch, Community Defense, Direct Action Security, and militias. Each of these, built for a different purpose, will also be structured in a slightly different way. For example, community defense and cop watch groups may not even be armed by default, but encouraged to arm themselves on the occasion that violence is being carried out in the area. Direct action security may often be armed in order to protect protesters from interference, as well as uniquely trained for protest safety tactics. However, there are examples of direct action security, such as the Bike Brigade, which are both effective and unarmed. By contrast, militias, as revolutionary bodies in waiting, will need to be armed and educated on the principles of military conflict, and should therefore read about military tactics and strategy, drill small unit tactics, and educate the community on its place in the larger revolutionary schema. What each defensive body holds in common, however, is that they should each be formed first at the level of the locality and should be based primarily on the needs of that locality.
So it's important to understand that these bodies of defense need to be legible and accountable to the communities that they're in. If they're not, there is the risk that they could do some very dangerous things and that nobody would even know who they were or how to hold them accountable if indeed they did something that the community did not approve of. Here by accountability, what I'm really saying is accountability to these revolutionary bodies, these community councils and these economic bodies. These should have a mechanism by which to both participate and to call into question the actions of these militia structures if they are formed. It's understandable if these militias are formed, they should be mostly clandestine, given that they are very likely to be suppressed by law enforcement and the state more broadly. However, if they are clandestine, they have the problem of not being legible to the very people that they are supposed to be protecting. So it's my recommendation that they begin as non-clandestine forces, and that they become clandestine in step with the suppression of the state. That is to say, if there is already a great deal of state suppression, then obviously they're going to have to start clandestine. But if you are in those occasions where you can be somewhat above ground, then you should probably default towards being more above ground so that you can actually interface with the community you are seeking to protect. However, as I emphasized, militias are not the only form of defense. They are just the form of defense that is going to allow us to weather this transition through a revolutionary juncture. That is to say, these militias are probably going to be the bodies that we combine together in order to create a sort of confederation of militant structures which will actually be able to defend the project. And I should emphasize, by a militia, I am talking about a group of people who are trained to do violence. I'm talking about a group of people who know how to use firearms, who know how to do small unit tactics, who know how to carry out the basics of warfare. That will require concerted action and conscious training if we are to create these bodies. It's also the reason why we cannot necessarily be distrustful of people who have a military background. These people are very likely to be able to train us to do the necessary things to build a successful unit, as well as to coordinate with other militia structures if things ever escalated to the point of civil conflict. The better trained we are ahead of time, the more likely we are to be able to defend what we have created and later, in a revolutionary conflict, overthrow the enemy. And I should note here that I don't actually think it's a good idea to rush into civil conflict or to rush into a revolutionary juncture against the state. Instead, I think it's best for us to use as much time as is available to us to prefigure all of the bodies that I'm mentioning here in the 4 pillars before the state tries to destroy us, because it absolutely will. And not only the state, but various forms of fascist counterinsurgency will also try to destroy us. When the time comes that this takes place, we have to be able to defend ourselves. We cannot be naive about what will happen in the future if we are successful in this prefigurative project. So we shouldn't be eager to do violence, but we should be capable. The last of the 4 pillars are what I call intelligence. This is to say, we need to be able to conduct intel operations as a movement. We need to be able to infiltrate the enemy. We need to be able to gather intelligence about their movements and their plans. We need to be able to conduct spycraft more broadly. We need to be able to actually provide a challenge to these intelligence agencies in both gathering information about us, and we need to provide a counterplay in gathering intelligence about them, because that is at the center of spycraft. And in order to do this, this aspect absolutely will have to be highly secretive and clandestine. And I give, in Constructing the Revolution, a mechanism by which we can carry out this intelligence and maintain anonymity and accountability at the same time, but I'm not going to belabor that here because it's somewhat involved. However, there need to be mechanisms by which these entities that are gathering intelligence can be held accountable, as the gathering of intelligence and intelligence in a general sense is a very likely place for you to get a runaway of power if you do not hold it in balance. Knowledge, as has been said, is power, and this is not some trite truism. This is actually accurate. So we have to take into account the power that is being given to the people who are going to attain all of this secret knowledge. We also have to be responsible in what we do and do not disseminate. That is to say, there is information which we can happily publish to the public and therefore undermine the operations of the enemy. And then there is information which has to be kept secret and only given to the people that are going to act upon it. Because the thing is that once the enemy knows that you know what it's doing, it can just change up its plans. So my general recommendation is that information about what the enemy is already doing or has done, that information should probably just be given to some form of, anonymous publisher, a sort of like copy of WikiLeaks, you might say. But for information that is about current movements, that is about the pertinent militant aspects of suppressing our movement and things we might be able to counter in what we do, that information should probably only be kept to the group of people who will be planning these militant actions. If you want to learn about how we can properly manage this compartmentalization, then you should watch the video Constructing the Revolution. However, here I just want to emphasize how incredibly important this aspect is. It makes or breaks revolutionary conflicts. So the last thing I want to say then is that none of this is going to take place without confederation. I've kind of talked about confederation a little bit before, but confederation is the idea that we take all of these autonomous bodies and then we create bodies that combine them together, by which they can all coordinate with one another. And we should try to make these confederations get bigger and bigger and bigger and subsume more and more and more territory, because these confederations will then allow more and more of these horizontal power structures to coordinate together. And more coordination that our horizontal power structures have, the more power that we all have by relation. So this form of revolution that I'm proposing here, you might call prefigurative revolution. And this is a form of revolution where we try to create the alternative power structures within the current conditions as much as is conceivably possible before that any form of revolutionary rupture takes place. We're not rushing towards the rupture. We don't want the rupture. We want to create as much power for the alternative as possible before that rupture takes place. Not only because this gives legitimacy to the revolution, because so many people are involved in that revolutionary activity that are having their ideology and their interpersonality transformed by social structures within the things as they exist, but also because this allows us to amass the most power before we have to go into conflict with the state and capital. It also means that if we are successful in overthrowing the state and capital, that we'll be more likely to be able to defend ourselves from external forms of intervention which have shown themselves to take place after any revolutionary juncture ever happens. This is to say, prefiguration is a way for us to resist imperialism and colonialism and other forms of intervention from external hierarchical power structures. Because it's been said you can do a revolution with somewhere around 3 to 5% of the population, I've heard. And we're proposing that we would build more and more and more. So as soon as we overcome that threshold of about 3 to 5%, we're probably going to be a considerable threat to the powers that be. And if they'll allow us to build larger than that 3 to 5%, 10, 20% of the populace subsumed into these horizontal structures, then there is probably very little they or any external source could possibly do to stop this revolution from taking place. And any attempt to attack and dismantle our horizontal power structures will probably backfire enormously. This also correlates with people being much more likely to defend the gains that they have made. It means that a lot of people are going to recognize that their interests are all tied up in these horizontal power structures now. These horizontal power structures provide them real things. The unions are there fighting for their benefits within their workplaces. The cooperatives are giving them forms of economic democracy by which they can determine their economic future. These mutual aid organizations are being funded by overages from those cooperatives and being funded by the money being funneled into them by the unions and so on. And this creates this large web of interconnections that people are very likely to fight for when the time comes. By contrast, if all we do is we rush into rupture and we have nothing to show for it, people are very likely to not support our rupture because they're going to look at us and they're going to say, well, I don't think that you are a legitimate alternative to the structures that exist. They're going to be afraid to sacrifice what they already have. But if we have built the horizontal structures, which can provide those things to them, then they can have pretty high confidence that we could then manage the rest of the economy, the rest of society, the rest of administering and coordinating all of these complex supply chains. So to recap what I've said, basically, in order for us to carry out a revolution, we have to be consistent with our principles. That is to say, we have to do this through direct action, which means we have to create alternatives to the structures that currently exist. Those alternatives are going to take the form of councils, economics, defense, and intelligence. And lastly, these have to be confederated together. They have to be combined into larger bodies that help them coordinate all of their horizontal powers together. So I think that's all I really wanted to say in this part of the lecture series. I just want to remind you that if you like this video, you should go down there and you should click like. If you have any thoughts or interests or concerns, you should go down to the comments and tell me what you think. Lastly, if this is like the third or fourth video you've been served up by the algorithm, you should go down and click subscribe because this is the sort of content that I create on this channel. Lastly, I just want to remind you that if you want to support not only my channel, but you want to also support Cooperation Tulsa, then you should go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount, $2, $5, $7, $12, $20, whatever you can spare. It will not only get you access to the Anarch Discord server where we have a fantastic community going, but 5% of all donations go to funding Cooperation Tulsa and developing the commons out at Flat Rock. But I think that's it for this video. There are going to be at least 2 more videos in this lecture series. The next one is probably going to be over the roadmap of revolution that I created in part 3 of A Modern Anarchism. And the last one is probably going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into part 4, which is as yet unreleased on the topic of organization. So stay tuned for that and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in seeing those later parts. Anyway, I think that's about it for this video. I'll see y'all next time.